So we've been looking at the book of Esther under this title of God Behind the Scene. Just to remind us, the book is set in ancient Persia during the reign of Xerxes. Now, we started looking this morning at Ezra Nehemiah, which records events which actually happened in the same broad time period. So this is one of those unusual moments in our life as a church where our evening series dovetails nicely with our morning series, but only for a few weeks, so we can enjoy it while it lasts. But where Ezra and Nehemiah describe what life was like for the people of God when they returned to the land, Esther describes what life was like for the people of God who stayed behind in Persia. So the book of Esther is set solely in ancient Persia, in Susa, one of the capitals. And while God is named in Ezra, Nehemiah, and God is so clearly active on behalf of his people in Ezra and Nehemiah, God's not named at all in the book of Esther. So it's a nice kind of counterpoint. And yet, as we've seen, as I hope we've seen, the story is told in such a way in Esther that invites us to see God's sovereign hand working all things together for good to those who love him. In spite of the fickleness of kings, in spite of those who hate God's people, in spite of the dangerous machinery of the empire working against God's people, and in spite of the people's own apparent faithlessness, God still works all things together. And what we've seen is that through one set of circumstances, Esther ends up becoming queen, married to Xerxes. But through another set of circumstances, there's an edict of death that's currently hanging over the Jewish people. And it appears that the only hope is for Esther to make a request to the king at the risk of her own life. There's a little bit of recap from before Easter. And as we saw last time in chapter 5, she makes that decisive step. So twice the king asks her what her request is. And as you might remember, twice she delays in telling him what her request is. And instead, she invites the king and Haman to first one banquet and then a second banquet. But it seems like it's a clever strategy because in doing so, as we saw last time, she effectively locks the king in to giving her permission for what she wants to do. She also guarantees Haman's presence with them when she does so. So her patience pays off. But to this point in the book, she's still not made her request. Meanwhile, also in chapter 5, as we saw last time, Haman's anger against Mordecai has reached boiling point, and with the advice of his wife and others, he's erected a ridiculously tall pole on which to impale Mordecai once he's secured the permission of the king. So chapter 5 leaves us hanging in the air, and if anything, the ante has been upped. Esther's still not made her request of the king, and her banquet will now be too late for Mordecai, who's about to be executed in the morning. What will happen to him now? So at the end of chapter 5, both Esther and Haman have made plans, but whose plan would be successful? And that brings us to our focus for this evening, chapter 6 and 7, in which we see a dramatic reversal. Now, we're still waiting for the next feast, when Esther will finally be able to make her request to the king, but it won't come until chapter 7. This is like one of those TV series where, episode 5 finishes on a cliffhanger, but you don't actually pick up episode 5 story until episode 7. You've got something else going on in episode 6, and then you come back to episode 5 and episode 7. That's kind of what's going on here in the book of Esther. Meanwhile, we have to make our way through episode 6, or chapter 6 in our case. And that's another way of heightening the suspense as we read. Now, I suggested last time that what happens over these chapters is like one of those elaborate contraptions where a ball drops down a chute, which opens a flap, which spins a wheel, which turns a pulley, which sends a series of dominoes falling, which presses a lever, and so on, which often ends up with something very mundane, like turning on the kettle. But you've seen those kinds of videos on YouTube, maybe. And that's what we see here. We've got one incident leading to another event, which leads to another moment, and so on, but which actually ends up with something very significant, nothing less than the salvation of God's people. So let's see how the story plays out. And we rejoin the story in chapter 6, where we see Mordecai's reward. Now, remember, as we join this chapter, everything is still hanging in the balance. Even if Esther is able to make her request to the king, it looks like Mordecai's fate is sealed. The pole on which his body is to be impaled has been put up, and Haman, it was set to ask the king's permission just as soon as morning arrived. He wanted to be there first thing to ask the king's permission. From a human perspective, there's no way out, at least for Mordecai. And yet, as one writer says, in a book where God's name isn't even mentioned, he refuses to be written out of the script. And it all begins with a sleepless night. It all starts, the ball drops down the chute. It all starts with the king being unable to sleep, as we see in verse 1. That night the king could not sleep. Literally, the sleep of the king fled. I wonder if you've ever thought that sleep has fled from me, it's departed from me. And that's the sense here. And even kings, it seems, have sleepless nights. But we're not told why or what it was that kept him awake. Why this night of all nights? Now, he wouldn't have had Netflix to watch, but he was a king, so he would have had lots of other things that could have distracted him. But of all the things he chose to do, we read in verse 1 that he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. Nothing like listening to your own life story when you can't get to sleep at night. Now, just to be clear, these Chronicles, we can read some of them from the ancient Near East. They're not page turners. Okay, these kind of chronicles tend to be just a catalogue of victories, lands conquered, peoples deposed, taxes imposed, and so on. And perhaps that's the point, actually. Perhaps the king was hoping that it would send him off to sleep. But why ask for the Chronicles to be read on this night of all nights? Well, the story goes on in verse 2. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Now, as you might recall, that refers back to an incident in chapter 2, where Mordecai saved the king's life. Way back then, I said to you, remember that? It's going to be important later. But why does this incident crop up at this point in the reading of the Chronicles on this night of all nights? Anyway, now the king is wide awake, I think we're meant to understand, and he asks a question in verse 3. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Now, again, this is crucial. Persian kings were noted for rewarding those who helped them. We have lots of stories in history about that. It was good PR, and it also helped protect the king from other assassination attempts. So it was a very natural question to ask what honor has been shown. And yet the rest of verse 3 tells us what we already know. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Now, of course, as we also know by now, Xerxes can't make decisions on his own. He needs someone to tell him what to do. But which of his counselors is going to be around so early in the morning? Well, the story goes on in verses 4 and 5. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants had answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So why does the king have a sleepless night on this night of all nights? Why does he choose to have the Chronicles read to him, all that he could have done? Why does the incident with Mordecai crop up in the Chronicles? Why does Haman just happen to be there when the king needs some advice? And what's going to happen now? Well, let's read on in verse 6. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now remember, Haman had come for an entirely different purpose, to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on his purpose-built spike. And we can imagine him, I think, coming into the king's presence and beginning to open his mouth, but before he can make his request, he's asked a question instead. And he responds in verses 6 to 9. Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Well, natural question. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, let them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. There you go. No expense spared. So now this is one of the rare moments in the book of Esther where the writer lets us know what's going on in someone's head. So now Haman thought to himself, we read in verse 6. Elsewhere, it's just kind of described. And it gives us a little window into his character, which fills out what we see of him elsewhere in the book, that he says, who else could the king have in mind but me? And we can imagine him, I think, momentarily rolling that thought around in his mind. In fact, I think the original text allows us to imagine that he starts and then pauses as he gathers his thoughts. What's he going to say? But of course, the king leaves out the crucial piece of information about who was to be honored. Interestingly, just as Haman left out the crucial piece of information about the identity of the people to be destroyed back in chapter 3. So it's kind of come back on him a bit here. And he saw this as an opportunity to ask for whatever he wished. Unlike Esther, you'll remember, who was very careful in responding to the king in the previous chapter, Haman doesn't have any of those polite, courtly phrases like, if it seems good to the king, or if I found favor in the king's sight. None of that here. He's just straight in there, again, in contrast to Esther in the previous chapter. Now, Haman doesn't need wealth or power because he's got those already. What he's essentially asking for here is to be treated like the king in public, to wear the king's robes and to ride the king's horse, with people giving him the honor that he thinks, frankly, he deserves. Now, that's not too much to ask for, is it? But things take a nasty turn for Haman, as we see in verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested. Pause, ... For Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. And you can imagine, I think, Haman trying to keep a poker face while his stomach is doing somersaults. The honors that he was expecting for himself go instead to his hated enemy. And what's more, he's the one who has to make it happen and has to follow it to the letter of his own recommendation. And he has to lead the procession, as verse 11 tells us. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. So while Haman plots how to kill Mordecai, the king how to honor him. And it's a series of seeming coincidences that brings it about. And that's what I think I want us to clock. The king just happens to have a sleepless night. He just happens to have the Chronicles of the Nation read to him. The story of Mordecai's loyalty just happens to come up. And Haman just happens to be around at the same time to be asked that fateful question. And Haman is so full of himself, he can only assume the king means him. After all, who else would the king want to honor? And as it's often said, pride goes before a fall, because he suddenly finds that he's been volunteered for the job of proclaiming Mordecai's honor to the whole city. Now, interestingly, and somewhat sadly, when Haman tells his wife and his friends about this and who the people are that he's conspired against, they go back on their earlier advice. Verses 12 to 14. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. He just seems to go back to what he's doing. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. Now, we're not told why they changed their minds. We're just not told. And Haman doesn't have time to ask them, because literally in the middle of the conversation, he's rushed away now to the banquet that Esther had planned back in chapter 5. And that allows now the next part of the story to unfold. But that's the first part of the dramatic reversal in these chapters, Mordecai's reward. So the next part comes in chapter 7 with Haman's retribution. So the story moves swiftly on in chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Now the king repeats the words that he's already spoken to Esther back in chapter 5. And Esther, for her part, is as careful and as savvy as she was back then. Now, remember, she needs to say what she has to say in a way that will incite the king against his friend and chief advisor, Haman, but she also needs to say it in a way that won't also implicate the king himself. Because remember, the king himself was just as much involved in what was going on. So she quotes the edict that Haman has made, but she doesn't mention Haman's name. Look at verses 3 and 4. Then Queen answered, "If I find favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." Those are the words from the edict. "If we'd merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." Now, we laugh, and yes, it is a right to laugh, but of course that would have been given in Persian society. The king can do what he wants. He can put into slavery anyone he likes. But notice, unlike Haman in the previous chapter, she goes through the courtly protocol. "If I found favor, if it pleases you," and she has a twofold request, the sparing of her own life and the sparing of her people. And now she's publicly added her own name to the list of those marked for slaughter. She quotes from the edict itself, as we've seen, and she makes clear to the king that if it be merely a matter of enslavement, such a small thing, she wouldn't have said a word. And of course, the thing is, she was effectively sold as a slave into Xerxes' harem. So there's something a bit more going on there. But notice what a brilliant, clever wordsmith she is. You know, she uses the passive voice, "I and my people have been sold." She doesn't identify who's guilty. What one writer helpfully points out that she has to intercede with the king on the empire's own terms. So there's no point in trying to appeal to this king's sense of right and wrong. He has no sense of right and wrong. There's no point in trying to argue the case that genocide is evil. There's no point in Esther saying, "My dear husband, I'd love to read a copy of the Torah with you this evening, and let's have a look at the Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments. We'll do a little Bible study." There's no point in doing that with Xerxes. The king isn't troubled by the mass slaughter of a people group, or he wouldn't have allowed the edict in the first place. He's not bothered by those sorts of things. So she has to speak to royalty on royalty's own terms, if that makes sense. It's an important tactic to bear in mind in our own engagement with people. What Esther does, in a sense, is similar to Nathan confronting David over his murder of Uriah and adultery with Bathsheba. You know that Nathan aroused David's curiosity, didn't he, by an indignation by telling a parable about a farmer and someone killing the farmer's favorite ewe lamb, which of course just arouses David's, kind of indignation that someone would do this, before Nathan reveals, "David, you yourself are that evil man." And that's a similar tactic that Esther uses here. The edict, it seems, has left so little impression on the king that it doesn't even ring a bell. But the king is angry that someone would attempt to injure the queen and her people, as we see in verse 5. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" And then comes the moment of revelation in verse 6. Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Dun, dun, dun. And his name does come last. Again, it's kind of left hanging, ... Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen, as you can imagine he would be. So when she reveals who it is, the king is so angry he has to leave the room. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Now, it's possible that the king has to think as well. Remember, he authorized Haman's edict. His royal seal had ratified it. So he's got a bit of a dilemma. How can he punish Haman for issuing a decree that he himself had approved? But Haman himself very conveniently solves that problem for him because things go from bad to worse for Haman in the first part of verse 8. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banqueting hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Now, history tells us that, you know, even if it was a king's concubine, you couldn't be within like 5 paces of a concubine in the king's court. So this was just unthinkable, what's happened here. Precisely at that moment, the king returns and Haman's fate is sealed. And the king, in a sense, is given exactly the excuse that he needs to get rid of Haman without implicating himself in Haman's edict. And so we read, the king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had a setter for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." And you can imagine Haman thinking, "Thanks a lot, mate." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Lots of irony in the passage as we see elsewhere in Esther. Mordecai, the Jew, dishonored Haman, the Agagite, by refusing to bow down before him. And now Haman falls before a Jew, and a Jewish woman at that, whom he's condemned to death, to plead with her for his life. What a complete reversal. And Haman's body is then impaled on the massive pole that he himself had built just 24 hours earlier to execute Mordecai. What a difference a day makes. Literally. Now, of course, from Esther's perspective, it's far from over, because even though Haman has been dealt with, his edict is still out there like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The sentence, at this point, the sentence of death still hangs over God's people. And what's going to happen to them? Well, you're going to have to come back next week to find out. But this is where the credits now roll up to the end of this particular episode, and we're left hanging. What's going to happen there? But meanwhile, there are lots of lessons from these chapters for us today. And as we close, I want to draw attention to 3 in particular. First of all, the invisible hand of God. Now, as we look through a window, maybe not on a day like today, but, you know, we can't see or feel the wind blowing, but we can see the bending of the branches of the trees. And so we know that the wind is at work. And so here in this part of the story, we can see, I think, the invisible hand of God at work. And it's important to spot, as we mentioned, the seemingly insignificant turning point. The turning point is not Esther's boldness or decision to approach the king, important though that was. No, in fact, as we've seen, Esther is completely absent in chapter 6. But God is turning people's fortunes around, restoring his people. The tables begin to turn, and they turn because of a sleepless night. That's where it all starts. In the destiny of God's people in the Persian Empire, everything depends, apparently, on the king being unable to fall asleep. And in that sense, the author very skillfully takes the focus away from human action. If the turning point was Esther's approach to the king, or Esther's challenge of Haman, something clever that Mordecai managed to do, then Esther or Mordecai would be in the spotlight. Instead, the writer lets us know, without naming him, that it's God who's behind the reversal. And that reinforces the message of the book that no one in the story, not even the most powerful person in the empire, is in control of what's happening. And in spite of all his power in Persia, Haman's plans come to nothing because the king had a sleepless night. And that sleepless night then kicks off a whole series of events that can't be accounted for as simply chance. God's hand at work, not just through his people, as we saw last time in Esther chapter 5, but God's hand at work through seemingly small and mundane events. Now, we know in Israel's past, God had used mighty miracles to deliver his people at the time of the Exodus. He does that, and he can do that. But here he uses ordinary and apparently insignificant life events to bring about his purposes. Only our God is so powerful and wise that he can work without miracles if he chooses to do so. That's the really clever thing. It's one thing to pull a miracle out of the box. It's another thing entirely, isn't it, to work through the ordinary, everyday events of life, through the lives of ordinary people, through years and centuries, maybe, in order to bring about his purposes. And of course, that works itself out in all sorts of ways in our lives, doesn't it? Consider the circumstances that have led you to this point in your life. Consider the circumstances that led you to becoming a Christian. You had a family member, maybe, or a friend, or an acquaintance at work who told you about Jesus, or you were invited to a meeting, or you were searching for significance, or you experienced some suffering and wondered what more there was to life. There was a whole series, probably, of seemingly small, insignificant links in a chain that brought you to faith. God brought you to himself through what on the face of it would look like a series of unconnected and unimportant events. And what about other aspects of your life, the things that led you and your spouse to come together if you're married, or the job that you're doing now, or where you live? The book of Esther gives us a way of acknowledging that God's care often actually doesn't come with miracles, and it doesn't need to come with miracles, but it can come through the unfolding circumstances of every single day. Now, of course, when we acknowledge that, we also acknowledge that not all those circumstances are pleasant, just as they weren't for Esther. There's sadness along the way. There's the death of loved ones. There's broken relationships. There's poor decisions. There's illness. There's sometimes long-term illness. There's the challenges of bringing up children. There's difficult choices to make. There's sometimes not enough money. And. But the message of Esther is that even these in the hand of God are links in an uninterrupted chain. We can face all these circumstances because of the security and hope our relationship with Jesus brings us, because what's at work is the invisible hand of God. And then secondly, I think the chapters have something to say to us about the inevitable judgment of God. Because I think this passage, these chapters also help us reflect on human evil in the world and the fact that God's justice will one day be done. And it gives serious warning to those who are not willing to bow their knee to God. The suddenness of Haman's death is, I think, very telling. Literally one day, he's on top of the world with wealth and power and political rank, boasting to his family and friends about his position and favor with the king and the queen. The next day, he's executed in disgrace. Overnight, the tables turn, and he didn't even see it coming. And sadly, as extreme as Haman was in his hate and his violence and his pride, that is the plight of all men and women who are outside Jesus, isn't it? That's the reality. And there's a mystery here too, I think, because just as God sovereignly works through the actions of his people, like Esther and Mordecai, and just as he works through seemingly insignificant events like a sleepless night, so also God works through and in spite of human evil. And evil won't have the last word. But God's oversight of all things doesn't let Haman off the hook. Do you notice that? There's no sense that because God was orchestrating things behind the scenes, that Haman was not responsible for his actions. He was just some kind of puppet that God was using. That's not the case at all. Even though the deliverance is brought about by God, Haman is still responsible for every single step that leads to his downfall and death. God is utterly in control, and Haman is utterly responsible. Judgment may not always be seen in our own lifetime, but God has promised a day when the truth will be revealed, when evil and injustice will finally be put down, and when those condemned will realize they have no one to blame but themselves. Book of Revelation, just as a starter, makes that painfully clear. It's only those who identify with Christ who will be delivered from death and judgment. As the Apostle Paul tells us, as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. And that brings us to our third and final implication from these chapters, the invincible Son of God. The chapters at one point invite us to answer a question. Who is the man that God, the great King, delights to honor? Who is the man that God delights to honor? And at the end of the day, there is only one answer to that question. None other than our Lord Jesus Christ. And that too comes about as a result of a great reversal. The one who is exalted is the one who didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a slave and becoming obedient, even to the shameful death on a cross. And whereas Mordecai was dressed in royal robes and honored, Jesus trod the road to the cross, exposed to public shame, and even suffered separation from the Father himself. But in the biggest and greatest reversal in the whole of human history, for this very reason, God raised him high above all and gave him the name that is above every name. One day, he will be at the head of a great victory parade. And as Paul tells us, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Amen.